Today we're starting a new series that are going to be looking at some of the fundamental or basic questions, big questions that people have when it comes to life, when it comes to God, when it comes to religion. We're going to begin by asking this big question of, does God exist? I mean, this is one of those basic questions that pretty much everyone in the world asks themselves at one point or another. Now, we come to different conclusions, we answer the question differently, but this is one of those big, important, basic, fundamental questions. Does God exist? And as we begin this series as part of the year-long theme of big questions, I'm excited to dig into some of these basic questions because a lot of times we think that we have moved past some of the fundamental questions. As Christians, if we've been Christians for a few years, a few decades, when's the last time we actually wondered if there was a God? In fact, when I briefly mentioned last week that we were going to look at this question, is there a God? I kind of felt like some of you gave me this face like, well, of course there's a God. You know, you're going to be preaching to the choir here, Pastor, because why else would we be in church if we didn't think that there was a God, right? But the thing of it is, this is a question that both believers and non-believers ask themselves at various points in their lives. See, we all have a breaking point. We all have times in life where we feel stretched to the point of breaking because of the things that have happened to us. Negative things, bad things, challenges, obstacles. And when we get to that point in life where we feel stretched to the point of breaking, many of us ask, does God exist? Is there a God? How can there be a God if so many things are happening to me, if I feel so stretched and I'm about to break? Is there really a God? Maybe you've grown up in church, and church is all you've known, and God is your default setting. Even though you might have grown up that way and heard about God for years, for decades, for your entire life, when those bad things come in life, when those challenges come, when those obstacles come, we might look up and think, all those answers that I grew up hearing in church, they don't really match up with real life. See, the thing is, in church, issues tend to be wrapped up in a nice package with a beautiful bow. But the problem comes in the fact that none of us live at church, right? Even though I'm the pastor, I still go home. And when we all go home, that's where real life happens. It's at home where the problems arise. It's at home where divorce occurs, where a cancer diagnosis is given, where abuse takes place. And when we hear things from church that have these issues and just have a nice little answer to them, when we go home and the real stuff happens, it makes us skeptical. Believers, non-believers, we can get skeptical when it comes to God because how can a God exist if these answers that I've heard don't match up? How can a God exist if these bad things keep happening to me or keep happening to the world around us? And so we are skeptical from time to time, even believers. See, the word skeptic, though, is interesting. It comes from the Greek word skeptisthai, which means to observe from a distance. Skeptic doesn't really mean to doubt. That's what a lot of people think it means, to doubt. It actually means to simply withdraw and observe from a distance, to try to investigate from a distance. So that's what happens a lot of times when we think about God as or we wonder about God, or we have these problems in life, and when we question whether God exists, a lot of us don't just completely reject God, we just take a step back, and we observe from a distance. I don't know if he really exists. I'm not sure. So I'm just going to sit over here and pull out my telescope and see if I can learn about God from over here, from a safe ways away. But the truth is, God cannot be observed from afar because he isn't data, he's a person. It's really impossible to get to know God from a distance, from trying to observe from a ways away, because it's not possible to really get to know someone from afar. If you really want to get to know a being, if you really want to get to know someone, you have to engage with the person. You have to be close. You have to have some back and forth. There has to be some connection. You can't really get to know someone from a distance. You can get to know about someone. You can get to know about something, about data, about facts, but you can never really know someone without drawing close. And that is why Jesus gives that invitation. His disciple Matthew writes about the life and teaching of Jesus, and he quotes Jesus as saying, "Come to me, all you who are tired and have heavy loads, and I will give you rest." This is an invitation that Jesus offers to come into a personal relationship. He says, don't just keep looking from afar, but come to me. Come get to know me. Come enter into a relationship with me. Come close, and you will see that I am here to be a blessing to you, that I will give you rest. Again, another disciple, John, he writes in his gospel, quoting Jesus as well. Jesus says, "If people choose to do what God wants, they will know that my teaching comes from God and not from me." In other words, Jesus says, if you really want to know that I'm telling the truth, if you really want to know that I'm who I say I am, if you really want to know that you can trust me, the only way to do that is to actually do that. The only way to know is to come and experience. The only way to know is to actually follow and put into practice and to come and engage in a relationship with me. The only way to know someone, the only way to know God especially, is by that drawing near to him. And we know this from our own human relationships, right? There's two factors that go into having a relationship with someone. The first is an experience, and the second is facts. Without those two things, you really don't know someone. The experience, for example, is how do they make me feel? When I spent time with them, are they funny? Do they make me laugh? Are they nervous? Do they set me on edge? Are they mean? Do they make me want to stay away? Well, what kind of person are they? What kind of experience have I had with them? How is it feel to be connected to them? What is that experience? And facts is, what do they like? What's their favorite food? What are their hobbies? What do they do for fun? And so when these two factors combine, then you have a relationship. Once you've experienced what it's like to be with that person, once you know who they are and what they're about. Have you ever wanted to have a relationship with someone that you were fairly certain didn't know you existed? Right? You're like, I that person's caught my eye. Oh, she, there's something special about her, or there's something special about him, and I want to really get to know them. I want to have a relationship with them, but they don't even know I'm alive. And so you sit and you try to think, how can I get them to notice me? Right? How can I get them to know that I exist? How can I get them to see me and to want to draw into a connection with me? What can I do to get their attention? And this is a question that I think God has. He looks at us as his children, and he knows that we at times we question if he exists. We question that, what's the point of even trying to have a relationship with God? We're just going to live and act and think that he doesn't exist. And so I think God sees us and he tries to do things to get our attention. One of the things I think that God does to get our attention is by giving us a restless spirit. The well-known, famous Wild West entertainer Buffalo Bill said, "My restless, roaming spirit would not allow me to remain at home for very long." And while I don't think any of us are Wild West entertainers, I think many of us can relate to that sentiment. There's something that keeps us from being settled. There's something that some of us have just inside us that wants to search for something more. That there's more than just working an 8 to 5 job and coming home and eating a dinner and going to bed and starting the day over again. That there's something more, and there's a spirit of restlessness, and so we search, and so many people search for that something to fit that final piece of the puzzle, to scratch that itch that we have. And we look for something to soothe that restless spirit that many of us have. And we look to power or to fortune or to relationships with other men or other women or drugs or whatever. We look for that something to satisfy that restless spirit within us. And God says, what you're looking for is me. This is why you haven't felt completely satisfied. Is because there's something in you that is searching for something more, and I am that something more. He tries to get our attention through that restless spirit. Another way that God tries to get our attention, to let us know that He exists, is through a special message. We see examples of this throughout Scripture. One such example is the Old Testament book, Samuel. He's an Old Testament prophet, and he shares a story when he was young. He writes in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10, that the Lord came and stood there. He called as he did before, saying, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel said, Speak, I am your servant, and I am listening. Here God comes to Samuel and he calls him by name and he gives him a special message that shapes the rest of his life. And while we might not hear a direct special message like that from God, I mean, God didn't even do that much in the Bible, and He doesn't do that too much in today's world either. But even though He might not call you by name, wake you up in the middle of the night shouting out your name, there are still ways that I believe God gives us special messages. For example, maybe you were looking at Facebook one day or another social media site, and maybe someone posted a picture with a nice scripture on there, or a short video clip that had a message that it just spoke to you in that moment, in your circumstances. Maybe you heard a song on the radio that you weren't expecting to hear, or you walked into a restaurant and overheard a conversation that you weren't a part of, and yet there was something in that conversation that met you where you were at, that spoke to a need that you had in your life. I believe God continues to give us special messages today in 2017. Now, the third way that God tries to get our attention is through unique circumstances. Something that's out of the ordinary. Something that's not just the ho-hum, everyday type of things that we experience in life. Sometimes these unique circumstances, sometimes they're joyful circumstances. Sometimes they're circumstances that bring us happiness, and we're just so overwhelmed. We're like, oh, I am so, this is so amazing. I'm so blessed that there's no other way that I could be experiencing such tremendous blessings other than God existing. Other times, those unique circumstances are difficult, are painful. And we think to ourselves, there's no way that I can survive this period of my life without there being a supernatural force sustaining me through it all. We see this time and time again. Special circumstances trying to get our attention back, focused on God. Lisa Turkers, a Christian author and speaker, says that brokenness is what must happen before God can put the pieces back together in the way that He can shine through the best. God tries to get our attention through special circumstances, through circumstances that might bring pain. Again, this does not mean that God brings us pain. This doesn't mean that God causes us to be hurt and to go through bad times. But when we do have those experiences, God is there with us saying, look, I'm here. I can help you through it. Just turn to me. Just look. Just acknowledge my existence. And He can use those circumstances to shine through the pain. Or other times, like this Picture I think I pulled off of Instagram says, sometimes I just look up and smile and say, I know that was you, God. Thanks. Sometimes we just get to that point in life where we just feel so good, we feel so blessed, that the only place we can attribute that blessing to is to God. God tries to get our attention through those unique circumstances. See, God cannot be observed from afar because he isn't data. He's a person. And he invites us to have that relationship with him. He's not just some knowledge that you can read about in a book. He's not just something, a star that you can observe in the sky. He invites you to get to know who he is directly and personally. But still you might think, okay, Pastor, but there's still plenty of people that reject the existence of God. There's still plenty of people that think, you know what, I've looked and there's just no way that God can exist. A prime example of this is the British philosopher, logician, and Nobel laureate, Bertrand Russell. He's a very well-known philosopher, and he had this strong atheistic sentiment. He said, if you accept the ordinary laws of science, you have to suppose that human life and life in general on this planet will die out in due course. It is a mere flash in the pan. It is a stage of decay in the solar system. He says, look, when you look at the world, you look at the science, you look at all of this, there's just no way that there can be a God. All it just shows is that humanity and life in general, it's just a blip on the screen. It's not going to be permanent. It's just part of the way the universe is going to be. We're going to be here, and then we're going to be gone. It's just a matter of time before decay sets in, and there's nothing left. It's interesting to note, though, that this was at the beginning of Bertrand Russell's career. He writes this statement towards the end of his career, towards the end of his life. He says, nothing can penetrate the loneliness of the human heart except the intensity of the highest order of the sort of love that the religious teachers have preached. It's interesting that this well-known atheist, towards the end of his life, almost does a complete 180. At the beginning, he says, look, the life is meaningless. We're just a blip on the radar. Everything is just going towards decay. But after his life of philosophy, after his life of study and thinking, he comes to the conclusion that the only thing that can penetrate our loneliness, that can penetrate our hearts, the only thing is the type of love that we find in religion. Now, he didn't become, a baptized Christian or anything, but he could see there's a definite shift as he thought about things, as he processed things, towards seeing that there needs to be some kind of higher power of love out there. Another well-known British philosopher who did make the complete change to become a Christian was a man named Antony Flew. He was definitely one of the world's most leading atheists. Just would try to argue till the sun or the cows came home, that the fact that there was no God. And yet, towards the end of his life, he wrote one final book titled There Is a God. And you can see the picture up there. He crossed out the word no and put a. There is a God. He said, after all my life of being a proponent of atheism, he said, the whole reasoning behind it, every person I told was, follow the evidence. He says, all of the evidence leads to the fact that there is no God. He said, but as I continue to live my life, as I continue to follow my own advice of following the evidence, he said, the more and more evidence I looked at, the more and more evidence I found for the existence of God. So, what are some of the evidences for God? Now again, this is not going to be exhaustive, but I think I'll present three of some of the major evidences that I believe we have for God. The first being the fact that conscious life exists. Not just life, but conscious life. Here's a picture of the Milky Way galaxy. And that circle, that little dot that you probably can't even make out, that's planet Earth. Talk about making someone feel small, right? We're just a speck on a speck, in a speck, surrounded by other specks, right? But scientists have determined that the amount of fine-tuning that it needed for life to exist just on this one small dot of a planet was 10 to the 37th power, which is 1 with 37 zeros after it. And by fine-tuning, I mean, if they compiled all of the factors that were necessary for life to exist. So, for example, if the Earth was just a little closer to the sun, we would burn up. It would be way too hot for life to exist. If the Earth was just a little farther from the sun, it would be too cold and everything would freeze and there would be no possible life to exist in that frozen element. If our solar system were just positioned a little differently in the galaxy, that would change everything. So all of these factors come in to show that the fine-tuning, just a precise location of our world, the precise things that are required for life to be in existence, is 10 to the 37th power. Now, that's hard to comprehend, right? It's really hard to comprehend a million, right? Well, like, what does a million look like? But this is not even a billion. This is not even a trillion. I don't even know what that number is. And so to help us kind of understand what 10 with 30 or what 1 with 37 zeros looks like, Dr. Hugh Ross writes in The Creator and the Cosmos on page 115, he says, 1 part in 10 to the 37th power is such an incredibly sensitive balance that it is hard to visualize. The following analogy might help. Cover the entire North American continent with dimes all the way up to the moon, a height about 239,000 miles. Next, pile dimes from here to the moon on 1 billion other continents the same size as North America. Now, I mean, you think of it, just 1 stack of dimes from here to the moon, that's a lot of dimes, right? Now, if you cover the entire continent of North America with stacks of dimes, that's even more dimes. That's hard to imagine. Now have 1 billion other North Americas filled with dimes stacked to the moon. That's a ton. It helps us understand, 10 to the 37th, but it's still such a huge number. Now paint 1 dime out of all of those. Paint 1 of those dimes red and mix it into the billions of piles of other dimes. Blindfold a friend and ask him to pick out 1 dime. The odds that he will pick out the red dime are 1 in 10 to the 37th power. That is very slim chance, right? As close to impossible as you can get, right? And that is the factor that leads to life here on earth. And not just life, like I said, conscious life. See, there's a big difference between life as like a single-celled organism floating in some ooze somewhere, right? But that's not what we are. We're conscious people. We're conscious beings. We can think, we can feel, we can learn, we can adapt, we can grow, we can be a part of our environment, we can change our environment. We can appreciate the beauty of this world. Does a single-celled organism appreciate the slime that it lives in? No, right? It's just trying to, squish along. I don't know. But here we are on this planet that is so tremendously fine-tuned, and we can reflect, think, learn, grow, and appreciate. We have conscious life. I believe that is an amazing piece of evidence that there is a God. Second, is that people have morals and values. I believe this is a big piece of evidence that God exists, that people have morals and values. Charles Darwin, the famous English naturalist and father of evolutionary theory, he says, in the struggle for survival, The fittest win out at the expense of their rivals because they succeed in adapting themselves best to their environment. See, this is the evolutionary view of life, that it's survival of the fittest. And if it really was survival of the fittest, what is the point of valuing human life? If it really is all about me surviving, if it really is a dog-eat-dog world, what's the point of me caring about my fellow human being? Why wouldn't I just go and stab everyone in the back and take their stuff and take their possessions and take their positions? And why wouldn't I just do whatever I wanted to do whenever I wanted to do it? There's this system, though, this innate understanding of right and wrong. Now, I know this varies from culture to culture. There are some things that are right in one culture that would be wrong in another culture. But still, every culture has this sense of right and wrong. I mean, if it really was just survival of the fittest, no one would really concern themselves with what was right or what was wrong. Everyone would just be out for themselves, doing what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. And yet, everyone has this inborn understanding of there are things that are right and things that are wrong. And still, even though there are some differences in cultures, there are still some fundamental things, there's fundamental values, fundamental morals that permeate, that are transcendent from culture to culture. For example, let's think of a culture where polygamy was acceptable, where it was okay for a man to have 3 wives or a woman to have 3 husbands or multiple husbands. And then there's cultures where monogamy is the standard, where it's just one wife, one husband. Now, sure, there's right and wrong, a little bit of a difference between those two cultures, but in both cultures, the principle is still faithfulness. It doesn't matter if you're married to 1 wife or to 3 wives, you're still expected to be faithful to your spouse, right? There's still that sense of right and wrong, an underlying current of morality that transcends culture. You're not going to find any culture that says it's okay for you to come and take my stuff, right? You're not going to find a remote island somewhere, a culture on top of a mountain somewhere, or a group of people in a big city somewhere that says, oh, you stole my TV? Oh, good, great, thank you, more power to you, enjoy it, right? There's no culture that says, yeah, come, steal from me. There's that right and wrong, that stealing is not acceptable. That's a transcendent moral, a transcendent value throughout the world, throughout culture. We're going to actually talk about this a little bit more in a few weeks when we spend actually the whole sermon asking that question, can we be moral without God? But I believe that the fact that people value other people, the fact that people have morals and standards and values, I believe that the fact points to the fact that there is a transcendent truth, a transcendent power out there that has impacted everyone and our sense of right and our sense of wrong. A third piece of evidence for God is the complexity and the beauty of nature. The psalmist writes in Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, "The heavens tell about the glory of God. The skies announce what his hands have made. Each new day tells more of the story. Each night reveals more and more about God's power." The Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. And you look up in the sky at night and you can understand why. You look and you see just through the naked eye the way the cosmos works. Even if you don't have any understanding of astronomy, there's just something in nature that says, man, that this points to a creator. And more than that, did you know that contrary to most people's opinions or thoughts, that there are a lot of scientists that believe in a higher power? In fact, the majority of physicists believe that there is a higher power. Physicists, they're the ones that study the natural laws, that see how the cosmos works, that see how the earth works, and see how their natural laws have been set up. And the vast majority of physicists say, you know what? There has to be a greater force out there that has set all this up. There cannot be all of these ordered laws that work in such harmony and such precision, that make the cosmos work in such understandable ways without there being a higher power out there. Now, this doesn't mean that all physicists, again, are Christian or anything like that, but the majority of these physicists, a lot of scientists do believe that there is evidence of a higher power. And it's not just evidence for God in the macro, in the big scale of creation. We see evidence for God in the micro scale, in the small scale, the microscopic scale. Remember Antony Flew, the atheist that followed the evidence? He wrote that actually the thing that pushed him over the edge, the evidence that really truly convinced him was DNA. He writes this: "What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together." He says, when you look at the complexity of DNA and how it transmits genes and how it just works in the system of life, he said that there can't be another explanation for the complexity of DNA and how it works to bring everything together other than the fact that there has to be a God out there. And according to New Scientist Journal, they did a study and they calculated that 1 teaspoon of DNA could hold all of the data humanity has ever produced. 1 teaspoon of DNA could hold every single song that has ever been written or played. It could hold every single movie and TV show that has ever been produced. It could hold every single book, novel, textbook. It could hold every single web page on the internet. It could hold all of that in the 1 teaspoon of DNA. That's how complex creation is at the microscopic level. I believe that there is evidence for God when we look to see the beauty and the complexity of the world around us. In fact, Owen Gingerich, who is a really well-known scientist, he was a Harvard professor and a senior astronomer at the Smithsonian Institute. This is not just a scientist that was doing some experiments off in some dark closet somewhere. He's the cream of the crop, well-respected, grade A scientist. And he says this: "To me, belief in a final cause, which is scientific speak for a creator God, gives a coherent understanding of why the universe seems so congenially designed for the existence of intelligent, self-reflective life." Here's this, supreme scientist. He says, when I look at science, when I look at nature, when I've observed all of these things, he said, the only thing that makes sense for the fact that we exist, and not just that we live, that we're intelligent life, that we are conscious life, that we are self-reflecting life, that it seems like the whole universe has been set up to support us as such, that the whole universe has been set up, has been so finely tuned for us to exist, to live, and to have conscious life. He said the only thing that makes sense for this whole system of life to be here is this final cause, is a creator God. And so, we have this big question: does God exist? I mean, this really is one of those big, fundamental questions of life. And unfortunately, there is no nice little package with a bow to answer this question. No one really, I don't think, can leave here just after a 30-minute sermon, thinking, I have all of the evidence, there's no more questions, it's settled, right? Because this is such a big question. But I think that Adventist speaker and author Ty Gibson sums it up nicely. He says, you can't prove the existence of God to the satisfaction of everybody in the world, but you can prove the existence of God to your own satisfaction. And this is the key, I think. Because when we ask these big questions, when we ask these questions that people have been asking for thousands of years, millions of people have asked, billions of people have asked, it's really tough to have a nice, conclusive answer for everyone to believe. But there is enough evidence for us to believe. There is enough evidence for you as an individual to look at and to see and to be convinced by. We can't force anyone else to be convinced by the evidence that we're convinced by, but we can be convinced in ourselves. And so that question, does God exist? The answer for me is yes. The answer for me is most definitely yes. But for you, the question might still be there. If you're still wrestling with that question, does God exist? If you know someone that is still wrestling with that question, does not God really exist? I invite you to give him a shot. I invite you to let go of your skepticism, to stop observing from a distance. I invite you to accept that invitation to draw close. The book of Psalm, the psalmist says, taste and see that the Lord is good. To come and to experience, not from a distance, but up close and personal. And when you do, when you take a look at the evidence, when you give God a chance by drawing close, I really believe that you will be convinced, that you will be satisfied in your own question.